What's up, legends? Welcome back to this week's episode of the Fitness and Lifestyle Podcast. With the pleasure of being joined today by a past guest of the show, Lachy Rowston. What's going on, brother? How you been?
I'm good. It's good to reconnect. Hopefully, we'll get to do it in person sometime, but I can't risk getting locked out of my state.
Fair call. Yeah, fair call. And I would say the same thing, but it's been ages, man. I mean, for those that are listening to the show that have been regular listeners, you would have heard me talk about Lachy's podcast recently, Lachy and Raf's podcast. How's it doing? You guys doing well with the podcast and keeping up with the episodes and getting some good feedback?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, it was good to get connected on that front, and yeah, the podcast has grown really well over the last, I guess, 12 months. Fortunate to have a digital business in, where the physical side of our companies, the gyms had to close. The podcast got to keep thriving, which was, just luck, really. It was fortunate. And we managed to get really good guests on. I guess the silver lining was obviously a lot of people that are hard to pin down because they're, traveling so much and they're on the road. We've got an opportunity to speak with them. So I'm sure you had similar opportunities as well.
Yeah, it was kind of like, what's your excuse now, man? You can't go anywhere.
Exactly.
You got a computer.
Exactly.
No, it's good, man. It's good. And you got the new gym coming along, which seems exciting as well, which is, I'm sure it's been a big project.
Yeah. So locker room was due to open 8 months ago, but now we're back on track and opening in a couple of weeks, so March 2020, and that's it'll be the first of its kind. It's been something that we've wanted to do for a long time, and I know I mentioned it to you well over a year ago. This new concept that we were building, but almost at the finish line. Well, really the start line, but almost finished the build.
Awesome. That's awesome, man. I'm looking forward to it. I really can't wait to get back up to Sydney and check it out and come back into the studio and see you boys and stuff. But we'll get stuck straight into it, man. So for those that have tuned into today's episode, you would kind of guess from the title of today's show. But I want to talk about functional strength training or functionally building up strength, which I know is something that you're really big into and very good at it, and teach a lot of other people how to do it through your socials and in person, obviously, and through the podcast. But I think when people get into the gym, you kind of go in one of two directions. You go in there purely trying to do strength training for whatever sport you're playing or for whatever specific goal that you have, or you go in there just to try and get jacked and just lift weight and do any exercise as possible to make the muscles grow with no real thought or no real direction on why you're doing certain exercises, or even kind of keeping in mind functional movement and mobility and stuff. So I wanted to chat about today how the listeners can incorporate more functional strength into their workouts, and also to get your thoughts on what that actually means. Because, I mean, you say functional strength to some people and they think it's like doing a fucking pistol squat on a Bosu ball while drinking a coffee and doing a push-up straight after. So that
would be impressive.
That would be impressive. That would be impressive. But what actually is functional strength training, and how can the listeners kind of incorporate it into their programming to make sure that, as well as looking good, we can still perform at our best and do movements properly and actually translate this strength from the gym into everyday life as well?
Yeah, I think you really hit it on the nail in that last sentence just there. It's the translation to everyday life, which is, I guess, what determines what you're doing is either functional or not functional. So for what I want to do in my everyday life is different to what you want to do in your everyday life. So really, I guess, functional, how I define it is the stuff that you're doing in the gym preparing you for whatever task you want to tackle. Now, the thing is that people will say yes under current circumstances. Maybe they're just kind of walking and going about their normal life, and then they decide they want to play sports. So all of a sudden what they're doing in the gym is not preparing them for playing social basketball again, for example. Yeah. So I think the term is fluid and the context is always relevant for whoever's training it. So my suggestion is, if you're listening to this and you think you're doing functional training, you just got to ask yourself, is what I'm doing in the gym helping me at whatever I'm doing in my life? And I guess, for some people the answer is yes. And so I say keep doing the same thing. But then for some people it's not, because there are so many exercises you can choose from, so many skills that you can acquire, from Olympic weightlifting to gymnastics to plyometric work, to just powerlifting, all this sort of stuff. And it's hard to know where to start. But I guess, working back from what you decide you want to need. So maybe, you're playing, social basketball. You're like, oh, I want to jump a bit higher. cool. All right, well, let's look at some body weight movements for jumping. Let's look at some plyometric work. Let's look at some knee rehabilitation stuff. Let's look at some Olympic weightlifting, because just doing deadlifts and back squats probably not going to be as useful for you as other tools could be.
I think it's important to understand as well, for those that are tuning in, that it's okay to still do your bicep curls. It's okay to still go in and do your accessory movements like your leg extensions and exercises that don't translate to any everyday activities. Because if your goal to some extent is to build muscle, then there are certain movements that you're going to have to do, or to increase volume, and that are just maybe enjoyable to you. Because, in the end of the day, I talk a lot about how there's fuck all point in doing any training program if you don't look forward to doing it. I mean, like, you need to enjoy your training. So for some people, they just love going in there and doing some 21s and getting the guns out and doing certain exercises that really don't translate to any everyday strength. But it's okay to keep them in there. But when we talk about the meat and potatoes of your training program and making sure the main lifts are heading in the direction that you're trying to achieve, that's when we talk about these exercises. So for someone that isn't playing any recreational sport, that's not... Jesus, I told you we'd get a guest. Russ, man, has just lost his shit. So my little puppy, he thought I was going to take him for some cardio, and I said no cardio today, and he's rampaging at the moment. Anyway, he's doing some functional strength work down here. But yeah, for someone that does not play in recreational sport, that doesn't have any specific exercise they're trying to prepare for, what are some generic type functional movements that people can incorporate into their training on a day-to-day basis? Because a lot of clients that I train aren't playing sport. They just want to get fit, but they also want to perform their best. They want to keep their mobility on point and be doing movements that are challenging, that are going to help them in their everyday life as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the approach I've taken with a lot of people is exactly what you said. There's definitely some accessory movements that you can work on, and there's definitely some bodybuilding stuff that's fun, that chest and biceps, and for girls glutes and all that stuff. And I say keep it in there. Like you said, keep in the stuff you enjoy. But yeah, there's some really major movements that if you kept them in and you used them on a consistent basis, it wouldn't have to be your whole program. Just make up maybe 20-30% of your program. You would get a lot of benefit from them. And for me, sort of what you mentioned, I start with the lower body. I find like the lower body presents a lot more issues than some of the other stuff that you can do with your upper body. So some of the main stuff is hips, knees, and ankles, because most people have either done a lot of running, or they've done some sort of sport, or they've sat down too much.
Yeah.
I mean, anyone listening to this has done one of those three things, if not all three of those things. And so you get some lower back issues, you get some hip issues, knee, ankle, foot issues, some variation of that, versus the upper body isn't as quite disabled as the lower body. So I just work on that sort of stuff: deep squats, deadlifts, Cossack squats.
But before you keep going, it's important to understand as well, for those listening, that all the issues tend to stem from the ground up. Like, if you do have your ankle and knee issues or your hip issues, then it's going to be of no surprise when you do start to get the lower back problems and you start to be slightly off with your shoulders, and everything kind of does stem from the ground up. So as Lachy just touched on, like, that, nailing that lower body stuff first can a lot of the time alleviate a lot of the issues you're having from above the hips as well, if you can get that lower body sorted.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think, some of the stuff you mentioned, obviously, I guess most people think of it as two legs. I just call it bilateral stuff. So just single pattern. So squats and deadlifts, incorporating, it becomes, I guess, more, quote unquote functional as soon as it becomes unilateral. So you add in, single leg elements like lunges, just basic stuff. I think people try and get super fancy, destabilize it with BOSU balls and stuff you mentioned, and weird band placements and stuff. It's not that necessary, to be honest. I think as long as you, as long as you do a combination of, lunging and rotational work and that sort of stuff, you're hitting most of what you need to do. People just like the fancy stuff because it looks good on Instagram, but honestly, you don't need that much of it. It's not as useful. If you go out there and run and you kind of pivot side to side in the gym and you do some Cossack squats and some rotational stuff, you throw a ball, you're getting 90% of the way there.
Yeah, it really is super fucking unnecessary with a lot of this stuff you see. It's like, functional strength is not about trying to make an exercise, a simple exercise, as difficult as possible and as dangerous as possible just to look fucking like an absolute king on your Instagram story. It is it is more so about trying to see what does translate. And I don't think a lot of people think about this. And I reckon trainers as well, a lot of trainers out there put no thought to what movements are translating to movements that we're doing in our everyday life. So for example, if we've got someone coming in who does do a lot of unilateral stuff or has issues with one side of their body, but all their training is bilateral, all their training is squats, leg press, double leg stuff, and they're never taking any time to fix that imbalance, then there's no surprise but that there's going to be no improvement, if not it's getting worse by overcompensation and stuff like that. You mentioned a few of those exercises before. When it comes to your warm-ups for your training, are you incorporating these type of movements for your warm-up? Like I've talked on the podcast before about how I approach warming up for a session in regards to the order I do it in. So I'll kind of go like a foam roll or self-myofascial release and mobility and then activation work and then get into the session. So how does like a warm-up look like for you? And are you incorporating some of these movements that you've mentioned into that little process before you train?
Yeah, I think the key with a warm-up was what I've discovered over the years of not only teaching myself, but who I will be the first to admit, I'm pretty lazy when it comes to warming up. But also for my clients is that if you just kind of do, 3 or 4 movements that cover everything, and you don't stress too much about specificity and trying to, do this perfect warm-up and activate this muscle, you're more likely to do it every time, which is what we were saying before. Like the perfect program's no good if you don't show up for it, right? So it's the same as a warm-up. The perfect warm-up's great, but if you don't do it, then it doesn't really matter. So some of the stuff I like to do is just, it's called, the short name for it is CARS. It's just the acronym for Controlled Articular Rotations. The guy, Dr. Andrea Spina from the States, he teaches it, but honestly, it just looks like joint circles. It's just a fancy name for joint circles. I do it at the hip, I do it at the shoulder, and then I work out from there. So I do, elbows, knees, ankles, wrists, and that gets me fairly warm. It makes me feel, it's a good way to kind of, all right, how stiff am I today? How much rotation do I have? Does anything need a pop or click? And it activates and warms up the muscles at the same time. You can just find them on YouTube, joint CARS. And so I just do a couple rounds of that. I do it in the morning. I do it throughout the day. I do it before my warm up. And then I think if you've been moving around enough throughout the day, you've been hydrating, you've got some steps in or that sort of thing, you're more or less ready to work out. It's just kind of building up slowly and not just being too aggressive when you start.
What's the best place for someone to start that's listening right now that hasn't really put much thought to their training program? They're following a pretty stock standard training split with the exercises that you would see in most people's training program that does want to make a start on, I guess, their journey to becoming a little bit more functional with their movements. What's like one exercise that someone can incorporate straight after listening to this episode the next time they head into the gym that's going to get them started on making some improvements? I know it's pretty fucking broad question, but yeah, what's something that you can recommend?
Well, I think the mistake that most people make when they do this stuff is they look at a couple of people they follow on Instagram and they probably put out good content and they just add the programs add the exercise in randomly to their program, which is great, but it's more beneficial, honestly, to just choose a program written by these people and kind of use the progressions and build it out over time, which is why I'm always cautious to give like one exercise sort of answer, but without beating around the bush too much. I mean, it's hard to go past something that I've learned recently from this guy, Ben Patrick. I'm sure you've seen him from Knees Over Toes. I don't know if you've got him on the show yet.
I haven't had him on now.
Obviously, with your background, I think you'd really like him and his stuff. But he's got what he's just coined the KOT split squat, which is just his knees over toes split squat, which is just a split squat, which just forces you into essentially a really long forward lunge. So you're basically trying to get your knees far over your toe as possible. Right. And I like it because if you've had any lower back issues in the past, it's a great way to load your legs heavy without loading your back. It's really easy to regress. So you can just raise your feet up, raise your heel up at the front. You can stack plates up. Yeah. Exactly. And it's just good because you're training really extreme mobility and trying to make your knee more bulletproof, your ankle more bulletproof, so that when you go and you start squatting again, you have more single leg strength and single leg balance. So I've really enjoyed that exercise. It's all over his Instagram, so you can just pick that one in and chuck it in.
I might chuck a link to that, and then maybe even I think I may have seen you doing that in one of your posts recently as well. So I might put a link to that post below, so you guys, because sometimes it's a bit hard to if you've never seen it before, to imagine in your head what it would look like.
Yeah.
I mean, this is probably something, obviously, that I could potentially chat about with him if I get him on the show. But a lot of the time, like the coaching cues is to try not to let your knees pass your toes when doing lunges and stuff for those that have issues with knee pain and stuff like that. So how have you found it? Like initially, was it quite awkward? Like for someone that does have bad knees or whatever, is this something that you would recommend right, like straight up, or what's the go there?
So I guess it's like, again, it's a bit contextual. Some people will have knee pain, do it, and then find during the process of this exercise, obviously it's regressed and it's scaled and it's appropriate, their knee pain will go away. And I've had that experience with a lot of my clients. However, there are some people whose knee pain is very traumatic or it's very painful. At those people, I don't get to do the exercise.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't get them to do it straight away if they're presenting with a lot of pain. I'll get them to do some other exercises that Ben recommends, some reverse sled walks and that sort of stuff to get them out of pain. My general rule is you don't work through pain. Unless I'm pretty happy with the client and we have a good relationship and I know what 1 out of 10 means for them versus 10 out of 10 and we're on the same page, I won't make a client work through a lot of pain there. But for most people, I think it's just a great mobility exercise as well. It's a great mobility exercise. Can't go past it.
A couple of questions off the back of what we spoke about with the more functional movements. How important is the actual load of these movements in terms of, are you still aiming to be progressively overloading just as you would on something such as like your standard bench press or barbell squat or deadlift or whatever? Or is it purely more so about movement and controlling the movement, going through the full range and making sure your mobility is up to speed? How is that a longer process compared to your normal lifts, or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so for me, it's look, I was progressing it at one point. So at one point I progressed it a very long way and I got up to a body weight KOT split squat, which is essentially his gold standard. His gold standard is body weight for 5 reps on each side, which is good. I think you should always progress things. The trap I fell into, which I guess any person that's done regular strength training, is that there's a temptation to see how far I can push things. Yeah. And in an exercise that was originally deemed for rehab and I guess mobility, it's not always the smartest thing to challenge how heavy you can push certain things. I guess that's why he said body weight for 5 reps is kind of the gold standard. He didn't say there was a platinum standard, but I tried to find whatever the platinum standard was, and I went a little bit too heavy and I did tweak my knee. So I guess there is a certain point that is good enough for certain exercises. And so that's all I'd say is like, progress it to a point which from his data and from his clients, he's like, get here and we're at a good level, and move to a different progression or a different exercise.
Another pretty broad question, but in regards to your programming, are you having specific days where it is mainly functional movements and mobility based movements on that one specific day, or are you keeping that spread across your training split? So are you doing, for example, if you were following like a push pull leg split, would you be adding 1 or 2 of these movements into each training session, or would you go in for one specific session and just do them all in the one go, and then on the other days you're just going back to your typical movements that you would see in most common programs?
No, so most of my training is a mix of all those things. So I'll do them on a frequent basis, just because I think for a lot of these things they need more frequent touches because you're not loading that heavy for a lot of these functional exercises. Versus say like a really heavy deadlift, as you start to do deadlift for a long time, as you know, eventually your top sets are like super draining. You can't do that stuff every single day, but you can do
central nervous system wise.
Yeah, exactly. You can do some kind of, functional hinging movement, like a single leg deadlift or a Cossack squat or something like that most days, some variation of that, because you're not going to load them. You're not going to do a Cossack squat 100 kilos, right? But the great movement to keep in there for a warm up or to maybe to build in some volume into like a workout or whatever. But I think, if you've always stuck to traditional training splits, like you said, push pull, which is even really a more recent thing, before that it was like arms, shoulders, legs, calves, whatever, every single muscle group on different days, you can,
left calf on a Monday, right calf on a Tuesday.
That's it. If you even hit calves. But you need to make sure that once you start breaking some of the traditional training paradigms and structures, then I think your ideas of what a workout can be can open up to a lot more. So for example, like I might do a workout which is 40 minutes. It might be on the minute for 10 rounds, and I'll throw in all these different exercises, which might be, standing barbell bicep curls mixed in with some, rowing machine mixed in with some Cossack squats and 90-90 hip switches, and you get
Cool.
a 40-minute workout in, you get a bit of a pump, get some conditioning in, you get some functional movement through your hips and some strength work there. So when you kind of break that paradigm a little bit, obviously it's different for everyone, but yeah, you can kind of find a place for this stuff everywhere.
The other, I guess, misconception that I find commonly gets brought up when I'm speaking with people about more functional movements is the fact that maybe people are unaware of the, let's say, hypertrophy benefits of still doing these exercises. Like you might say to someone, all right, we're going to do some of these movements that are a bit more functional. And all of a sudden the mindset is like, oh, fuck, I won't build muscle now because I'm not doing I'm not doing an overhead press. Or I'm not doing lateral raises. I'm doing this weird movement now. But have you seen many benefits? Have you seen much benefit with, and even crossover into other movements, like the strength you've gained from these functional movements, which has then helped with, say, your barbell squat or your bench press or overhead pressing? And in terms of muscle growth, have you seen much benefit there?
Yeah, I've seen more benefit. So I think it's funny. There's this really good meme of Lu Xiaojun, who's like one of the most aesthetic Olympic weightlifters in the world, and he's won multiple gold medals. He's doing a snatch. And I think the meme is like, and there's this bro at the gym with a towel around his neck going, what muscle is that for? And this guy's obviously activated his every muscle in his back. And I think that it's just an old way of thinking. It's just, I guess, two worlds of thinking clashing together. There's this performance world where they don't really care about what muscle are they training necessarily. And then there's this bodybuilding world, which is like, okay, which muscles are we training? That's all I care about.
Yeah.
And neither are right or wrong. But I think, if you take from the performance world into what most people are in, which is the aesthetic world, what you'll realize is you will still gain muscle. You'll still gain weight. Like these muscles do what muscles do. They don't care if they're doing a functional exercise or they're doing a bodybuilding exercise. If they're working hard and they're stabilizing and they're tensing and they're being overloaded, doesn't matter what the exercise is, they're going to grow. And I would say that, the non sort of functional movements, the more traditional movements, they just use less muscles. They're, I guess, in some ways they don't use less muscles. They're just not, the planes of motion are a lot simpler. And so when you make the movements a little bit more complex, you'll find all these different muscles get sore and turn on in ways that you just didn't know could previously. So you get benefits there.
That's awesome. And man, like I said to you before we had a chat, I wanted to keep this one relatively short and hopefully get you on a bit more often. We'll touch on more specific kind of topics each time we have a bit of a chat. But obviously people will come and check out your content. I'll have all the links in the show notes below. But is there anyone in particular, apart from the knees over toes guy, that you can recommend that people can go and suss out for a bit of an idea of some of these movements that maybe that you get some content from and ideas from as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's two guys actually. You're in your local hood in Melbourne. Eugene Teo, he's got some pretty good stuff in there. And then this guy, I can't remember what his name is, but his YouTube channel is Fitness FAQs. He's a gymnastics guy.
Okay.
Self-taught gymnastics guy. He's got, I think, over 1 million subscribers on YouTube. So in the calisthenics world, he's one of the most well-regarded, most well-known, I guess, trainers and PTs out there. But what's fascinating about his story is that he started gymnastics or calisthenics training at 18 after doing bro splits at the gym.
Okay.
And some of the stuff he can do now, multiple reps, one-arm chin-ups, planches, long handstands, crazy level stuff. But I think it's a pretty cool story because he wasn't just some super high level gymnast as a kid and then just decided to start showing off on Instagram when the app got developed. He actually built this stuff from, essentially just being a normal bro at the gym. So those two guys have some really good insights on training.
Awesome. Well, brother, appreciate your time today. It's good to see you. Hopefully see you in person soon, but I'll have all the links to all your content below, of course, as always. Guys, make sure you go and check out the podcast, check out some of Lachy's content on socials, and hope to have you back on soon, man. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, bro. Appreciate it. Always good chat.